Stanford University.
So I'm Carl Knapp. I'm from MAP Royalty. We work a lot with Energy Crossroads and a lot of other student groups at Stanford on trying to put on some of these energy and environmental issues. I'm the director of sustainable energy education there. And part of what we do is teach classes here at Stanford. And how many energy resources students do we have here today? Got a few. We also have, how many sustainable energy fellows do we have? Well, there's one. Okay. So we also sponsor some fellowships at several different NGOs. In fact, we have 2 one-year fellowships with WorldWatch. And so Chris Flavin is president of WorldWatch. He's so WorldWatch is an independent research organization that works on energy, resource, and environmental issues. It's not just about energy, but particularly been working lately on how to replace fossil fuels with through energy technology and policy strategies. We're also, for those who are interested, one of the 2 fellowships is a one-year fellowship that starts almost right away. There's some flyers out on the table outside. It's to work on a natural gas and sustainable energy initiative. And Chris might mention something about that later. Chris is on several boards. I can't even list them all. Business Council for Sustainable Energy. He's a board member of the Climate Institute. On advisory boards for ACOR, the American Council on Renewable Energy. Also, he's authored several books. One, Power Surge, which I read when I first came back to get my PhD in 1994. And even though it's 15 years old, it's still pretty much something I tell everybody they should read if they want to know what the future of the electric power industry is. Also, he's a co-author of the State of the World report, which comes out every year. There's quite a few documents outside on the table outside if you want to check out what some of the WorldWatch literature's that's available. A lot of it's available online for free too. You'll also see him coming up in New York Times. Even I have to mention the word Harvard, the Harvard International Review, Time Magazine, and also MIT's Technology Review. He's from Monterey, California. Went to Williams College. Anybody here from Williams? No shout outs. Oh, we got, really? Oh, one in the back. Wow. Where he majored in economics, biology, and environmental studies. Now, Snuller Price, I had the joy of meeting him actually when he came back for his master's. I was here doing my PhD. And, so he's been with energy and environmental economics in San Francisco for 16 years now.
Something like that.
Working in the energy field. He heads their practice on climate change. But he's worked on everything from electric and natural gas utility resource planning to renewables, energy efficiency, distributed generation, reliability modeling. And what he's going to talk about some today is the work that they've been doing with the CPUC and the state of California, taking a look at climate modeling for how do they actually, what are some feasible ways to actually get this 80% reduction by 2050? And it's a nice contrast to what Chris is going to talk about, which is taking a look at over the next 2 decades rather than the next 4 decades, from a global perspective, what can we do about transitioning to a low-carbon economy? So we have a 2-decade view from an entire world point of view, where there's a lot of coal and a lot of opportunity for natural gas to make a difference, as opposed to a longer-term view starting just on a California regional perspective, where there isn't very much coal, hardly any at all, a lot of natural gas, and what role might that have if you're thinking about getting a real 80% by 2050 reduction. E3 also has a summer internship program. We've got some flyers out there. So this is somewhat of an ad for people who actually want to work in this field. Come work for these guys. They're a lot of fun to work for. Snuller got his master's in what used to be EES and OR, which is now MS&E. It's a lot easier to say. Engineering, Economic Systems, and Operations Research from Stanford. Also got his BA in Economics from Swarthmore. So we're going to start off with Chris talking about this global perspective to 2030. Then Snuller's going to talk about the California view. And if you can hold your questions to the end, then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. And then once we're all done, Q&A.
Well, thanks very much, Carl. It's a real pleasure to be here at Stanford. And
the MAP program, the Stanford MAP program, has been incredibly generous to WorldWatch. We've had a number of really strong young people coming through our energy and climate program and have really contributed greatly to our work over the last several years. So thank you so much for what you and Peggy and Jane are doing to allow us to, and particularly in very tight financial times, to have young fellows to be able to contribute to the research is a very, very big contribution. My talk today is actually the first time I've given this particular talk, because this is a new initiative that we're really just beginning at WorldWatch right now. And let me just give you a little bit of sort of background in terms of where we're coming to this from. WorldWatch has been advocating, literally for decades now, for a major energy transition to reliance on renewable energy and energy efficiency. And the focus, particularly in recent years, has been how do you build a low-carbon economy? A low-carbon economy not only in the United States, but of course worldwide. And we've got a major focus right now on India and China as, of course, two pivotal countries, very quickly growing energy systems, currently pretty carbon intensive, which I think have the potential to be a real pivot point for the economy. Through the range of research and writing that I've done, again, over the decades, I've become convinced that it is going to be possible a lot faster and a lot more economically than most in the energy industry believe to transition to a very different kind of energy system, one in which efficiency levels are vastly improved, where renewables gradually replace fossil fuels, and where we have a dramatically lower carbon footprint, on the order of 80 to 90% below where we are today. It's also clear, though, that this transition has to happen globally. Individual countries do not exist in isolation at this point. From an atmospheric point of view, arguably China is the most important country in the world right now. But beyond that, these are global markets, and I think there will be a natural tendency, if a new path is developed, that the world as a whole will tend to follow it. So coming at this as basically an optimist and feeling that this is very much doable if we can get the kind of policy change needed to drive it, I came perhaps to the somewhat surprising conclusion just a few months ago that natural gas, which in some ways is sort of one of the least noticed, sort of most boring, sort of most taken for granted of all of the energy sources, actually has a really critical role to play, and maybe even sort of a decisive role in terms of allowing us to have the kind of rapid decarbonization, particularly of our electricity system. Because of course scientists are telling us, and we reported this in State of the World 2009, published earlier this year, that the reductions need to begin essentially immediately. And that's true globally, again, not just in the industrial countries. But the thing that really turned me around on natural gas, and I have been basically advocating that natural gas among the fossil fuels was the natural bridge to renewable energy since the early 1990s. But the thing that really caused me to sort of take a whole nother look at this is that there have been some developments in terms of the ability to exploit gas from what are called unconventional sources, which turn out to be much more widely available than the resources that we've relied on in the past. It's required new technology to be able to develop them, but that they've so expanded the potential resource base and have held out the possibility of natural gas being economically competitive with other energy sources over an extended period of time, that it is in the words of Tim Wirth, who's the president of the UN Foundation and shares my view on this, a true game changer in terms of energy strategy, but also a game changer in terms of energy politics and being able to overcome the absolute, logjam that currently exists in Washington that I think is in the process of denying us the ability to have sufficiently strong legislation. So let me just move into some specific slides to give you some data points that I think back this up. This graph shows the emissions from basically a state-of-the-art new coal-fired power plant today and from a state-of-the-art new natural gas-fired power plant today. In the case of coal, 820 kilograms carbon dioxide per megawatt hour. In the case of natural gas, 330 kilograms. The emissions from the coal plant are roughly 2.5 times. Or in other words, you could get a more than 40% reduction in your emissions if you were to, say, take a given fleet of coal plants and transition them over. Now, I think this actually understates the potential, because the average existing coal plant in the United States and indeed in China, where the two biggest coal burners, is actually much less efficient than this state-of-the-art. This represents a 39% efficient plant. The natural gas plant, by the way, which would be a combined cycle plant, is 55%. It turns out you can actually just consume natural gas a lot more efficiently, and that, combined with the fact that it's a less carbon-intensive fuel, gives you this ratio. So the actual reductions, again, if you were just to replace an old coal plant, particularly if you started with the oldest, dirtiest, least efficient ones, and we have a lot of coal plants in this country that are actually 50 to 70 years old, don't even meet the basic standards for conventional pollutants, you could get an even much bigger emissions reduction than is demonstrated here. Economics, of course, is going to be a key driver, and one has to really focus in on the economics in order to really be able to figure out what role natural gas has to play potentially in dealing with these issues. The big advantage that coal has tended to have is that coal is very inexpensive compared to other energy sources. So the fuel cost here is at the top in the sort of beige color, and you can see that the fuel cost for coal is much smaller than it is for natural gas. However, the construction costs, which are in purple at the bottom there, are significantly higher in the case of coal. The big variable, though, is really the price of natural gas. Now, this figure represents where natural gas prices were before we had the extreme run-up at the end, in the later part of 2008, but represents prices that are actually higher than where natural gas is today. So, by this calculation, the new natural gas-fired power plant is still a little bit more expensive. At today's natural gas prices, that gap would largely be closed. Another way to look at this, though, is if you had a carbon price of about $20 per ton, which of course would hit the coal plant a lot harder than the gas plant because of the different carbon intensity, it would essentially close that gap even at the prices that we're assuming here. And you can see then that wind, actually, just to give you a comparison with renewables, wind is actually in between coal and gas in terms of current prices. Solar, and this would be solar central power developed in, say, the deserts of Southern California, a bit more expensive, and nuclear also on the high cost end of things. One of the things, though, that I think is not getting anywhere near the attention that it deserves, despite the fact that we've had a large increase, actually, in gas-fired generation in this country over the last decade. In fact, most of what has been added has been either natural gas or wind. There's been very little coal and no nuclear built in recent years. But most of that gas capacity are these large combined cycle plants, or gas turbine systems that are designed to meet peak loads. What we're not yet doing yet in any really significant magnitude is using natural gas in the way that it would be most effectively used within the power sector, which is for combined heat and power. Even a state-of-the-art combined cycle plant is turning 45% of the energy in the fuel into waste heat, and then additional losses in the distribution of power. If, however, you were to have decentralized power systems in factories, in commercial buildings, even indeed in residential buildings, much of that waste heat that then could in effect be recovered and utilized, and you can get up to efficiency levels of 80+% in many cases by going to those kinds of systems. Cogeneration, well, let me go to the next slide. Cogeneration is already very extensively used in quite a number of countries. You can see that in Denmark it's over 50%. In that case, these are largely district heating plants that also produce electricity, many of them gas-fired and a fair number of them biomass-fired. You can see it's very high in Finland. That's mainly from the forest products industry. In Russia, that is largely a legacy of Soviet-era district heating systems that are still in place, but that could be made much more efficient. And then you can see China is actually already pursuing this pretty actively, is at about 12-13%. And you can see the United States is not at the bottom of the pack, but we're down at about 8%. We really just have not provided much of an incentive scheme, nor, by the way, has Japan, which has a very strong electric power industry, which has resisted this. So most of this cogeneration that's in place today, it's either industrial or it's based on these district heating systems. But there's a really exciting development that is now, I think, really going to change the equation, which is that it is becoming possible to produce really small-scale power units, down again to residential scale, and to do it quite economically, to basically mass-produce power plants. And I think you will understand how easy this really is when I tell you who are I think, going to be the two leading companies in this space. It's Volkswagen and Honda. These are basically automobile engines, folks. And of course, all of the work that's been done to limit emissions and to reduce noise turns these into something that sits right in your basement, produces your hot water, produces your heat, produces your electricity, and can be, of course, hooked into the smart grid so that even, if you're at work and maybe you don't really need the heat right then, but the grid really needs the electricity, that these things can be rapidly turned on and off. And here's the really big difference, and it's true actually of the larger gas units as well as the smaller ones, between that and these baseload coal plants, which dominate the U.S. power system. Over half of our power is being produced that way. Coal-fired power plants, these large units, are very inflexible, so that if demand fluctuates, you can't change the power output quickly or easily. And that has caused all kinds of problems. It's already causing problems today. Of course, demand naturally fluctuates night to day. It's getting more extreme because as many parts of this country lose industry, a higher and higher share of the load are commercial and residential buildings, which of course the demand for power in those goes up dramatically depending on the time of day. So we have an inflexible power system not set up to deal with that, let alone set up to deal with these intermittent energy sources, the renewables, which are now the fastest growing part of the power market, particularly wind and solar power. So natural gas, both in cogeneration mode, but also more flexible turbines that are being developed that have a combination of relatively high efficiency and the flexibility, allow you to meet those demands. I read something the other day that indicated that the average coal-fired power plant takes about 12 hours to fully get up and running from a cold shutdown, and apparently these gasification coal plants that are now being built can take as long as 48 hours, whereas these systems I think can be designed so that you get a virtually instantaneous response that again can, if you want, be modulated through the smart grid. So let me shift gears and talk to you about the supply side, because all of what I've just said would be interesting but largely irrelevant to energy strategy if we thought about gas supplies the way we've basically thought about them for the last few decades. The assumption has been basically that we've already used up most of the gas, that we're past peak gas, as the geologists would say, and that it is simply a resource that is not sufficiently abundant. So the argument that's made again and again and again is we have to use the coal because we have lots of coal. It's our most abundant energy resource, et cetera. Look at this curve. I really think this is quite remarkable. I'm sorry it doesn't go back a little further because it misses out on the earlier growth period. But you can see, in the case of both natural gas and oil, the peak in U.S. production came in about 1970. And we had a system of price controls and all kinds of things that happened over the next decade or two. And natural gas production in the U.S. came down a bit in the 1980s and then sort of bounced around, roughly flatlining, whereas oil throughout this period was actually declining. There was a time when U.S. lower 48 oil production was much higher than gas production. So by the time you get to 1990, gas is already ahead. But then look at what's happened since then. Gas has been relatively steady, perhaps a slight upward growth, and then a steady downward trend in terms of production of oil. Now, interestingly, the unconventional gas, which is what I'm focusing on here, really only began to be developed in a significant way back in the mid to late 1990s, and that was mainly tight sands and coal bed methane. The real revolution that's coming forth today is in what's called shale gas, and that really only began to enter the commercial market in a serious way after 2000, and that is what is responsible for that very sharp trend upward over the last few years, which marks the point at which really large-scale commercial development began. This also shows the story. I'm not sure how much of this you can see from where you're sitting. The line at the very bottom shows production of natural gas in Alaska, which is basically limited by unavailability of pipelines. So you can see it jumped up there. I'm sorry, this is a projection. So look at just the left-hand part up to 2000, if you will. Look at the trend there. So Alaska is flat up through there. And then you can see that there has been a significant growth in, let's start at the top there, the red line. Onshore conventional has been going down rather steadily. Most of that is associated with oil, and that's basically a declining resource. And then offshore conventional, which is the green line, has been basically flat and now beginning to trend downward fairly significantly. And then the blue line is really the one to keep an eye on. You can see there the tremendous growth up to where we are today, and then a projection of continued growth, and then continuing to be very high over an extended period there. So here we're zeroing in on this unconventional gas development. Tight sands, as I mentioned at the bottom, has been sort of dominant early on. Coal bed methane coming on, and then shale really just starting to emerge significantly now. Just a couple words about what these resources are. These are resources that really were not developed early because almost all of the natural gas was basically found as a byproduct of oil exploration. And so there is a lot of associated oil and gas that's out there to be developed. That marked, the first several decades of the U.S. natural gas industry. Tight sands or formations that hold natural gas that's more difficult to get it out. Coal bed methane, as you can envision, a lot of coal seams do have methane in them. That's why you have frequently explosions in coal mines. And then shale, I think, again, is probably going to end up in the long run being the most significant. Shale is a sedimentary rock. Formations are really quite widely spread across the world, but it's essentially an impermeable rock. It's what the geologists call a source rock. That is, the gas is actually generated there when that shale was actually being formed from the microorganisms in the seawater that got left behind as that was turning to mud and then solidifying. And it's a combination of new technologies, the ability to fracture that using water under pressure, and then horizontal drilling, which allows you to access the resource that has allowed the industry to begin developing these resources. This shows the estimates of how much natural gas is available in the U.S. Going back to the 70s up to a little after the year 2000. And you can see how these estimates have grown up very rapidly as these shale resources were identified. This is a map of, and again, this is just the shale piece of this. This is one of the three kinds of unconventional gas. This shows the major natural gas containing shale formations in the United States. The ones that have been developed so far are those that are down in the Southwest. There's something called the Barnett and something called the Haynesworth that are down in that area. So that's where most of the development has been. You can see, though, that there are shale formations in quite a few parts of the country, and that the largest by far is actually in the Northeast down the Appalachians. That one is called the Marcellus, and there is an absolute gas boom that is underway, gas drilling very extensively throughout that area, particularly in areas of New York and Pennsylvania. You see the natural gas pipeline grid of the United States laid out here. And there are really two advantages that the U.S. has over most of the rest of the world that is allowing us to get into these new resources very quickly. One is, of course, we have a very substantial oil and gas industry, which is actually dominated not by the majors like Exxon and Shell, but is really dominated by independent companies, most of which you would never have heard of. But secondly, we've got this pipeline network. So you can see that most of the shale resources, particularly in the Southwest and this huge Marcellus field, all of it is relatively close to pipelines. So there's relatively modest infrastructure development that would be required to get this natural gas to market. So this lines up on the left an estimate which essentially reflects what an official body called the Potential Gas Committee has put together, estimating that the total is, I think this is in trillion cubic feet, 1864, compared to a figure of just 1137 back as recently as 2003. I mean, that's a remarkably huge change in such a short period of time, and has essentially been recognized and endorsed by the premier group of geologists that estimate these kinds of figures. This figure, to just give you a little bit of perspective, represents a resource base that is equivalent to just a little under 100 years of supply at the current rate of production of natural gas in the United States. You can't say these things with too much precision, but I think it's fair to say on an order of magnitude, if these numbers are true, and I think they are, natural gas is similar in abundance to coal. Suddenly you've got the cleanest of the fossil fuels, and one that has all of those advantages in terms of flexibility and ability to integrate with renewables, being perhaps as abundant as coal is. One of the differences here, estimated coal resources in the U.S. have actually gone down in recent years. And you say, well, why is that? I mean, there must be technology being applied there as well. Well, coal resources are actually pretty abundant, pretty evident. I mean, they tend to be near the surface. It's a solid fuel. I mean, we basically figured out the landscape, a half century ago in terms of what the coal resource was of this country. And it turns out, there probably were some overestimates that were put in there, particularly in terms of high quality coal. Some areas are really starting already to go to lower and lower grade coal. Whereas this natural gas is, I mean, to some extent, it's been known for a long time that shales had gas, but it was not considered a usable resource. The other thing is that a lot of this is several thousand feet down. So it wasn't easy to reach until fairly recently, whereas, again, most of the coal resources are relatively close to the surface. It turns out that just from a sort of chemical and physical point of view, natural gas can exist under pressures and temperatures where you would never find oil and coal because they simply couldn't last millions of years under those conditions. Very simple molecule, methane, of course. It has very different characteristics than the other fossil fuels. Here's a forecast in terms of where things might be headed in the future as shale develops quickly, as coal bed basically maintains where it is, tight sands gas expands somewhat, and the conventional continues to decline. This is a significant increase potentially that could occur over a relatively short period. I mean, this goes out basically to 2030, so most of the increase could occur over the next, roughly a decade or so. It's a large resource, but I also think it's worth pointing out that it is not an unlimited resource. So we're not suggesting that natural gas would take over the energy system, but what we are suggesting is that there is enough natural gas out there that if we use it very efficiently, and if we put it in together with the new renewable energy technologies, that it could be a real bridge and an accelerator in this energy transition. Let me just say a couple words about prices, because as I mentioned in terms of power generation, this is extremely important. The question you always have to ask, of course, is what is it going to cost to get these unconventional resources out? Now, one of the reasons the industry didn't turn to any of this until fairly recently is natural gas prices have tended to be quite low. They were really low and fairly stable for a period of roughly 20 years up until the last 5 or 6 years. And they were basically too low to support this unconventional gas development. You can see those relatively low prices. Traditionally and typically, gas prices are something on the order of 30%, maybe 20% less than oil prices. Look at what's happened recently. We, of course, have gotten into a very substantial run-up in oil prices, and the gas prices have gone up as well, in part in response to this sort of commodity boom in the oil market, which has helped pull gas prices up, but also because those very cheap conventional supplies were running out, and it required a higher price to then deliver these unconventional sources of natural gas. But I think the most important thing to look at here is look at this divergence in prices. Throughout the last year and a half, for the first time really ever, and you don't find this, by the way, in any other part of the world, oil prices have been well more than double natural gas prices. These are now decoupling for the first time, and I think that they will probably become something close to permanently decoupled, in part because we're not using any more oil essentially at all for power generation, but because these are different markets. The oil market is basically set in the Middle East. It depends on how much OPEC is producing its world oil supplies. This is very much a North American market. This is U.S. and Canada. There is sort of a ceiling in terms of what you can bring in liquefied natural gas for that will always keep it from going too high. But I think there's a good chance that we will see much more price stability in natural gas in the future, because the market is essentially going to find a price now. Again, it can't be too low because you can't develop the natural gas prices if you go certainly much below where we are now, which is basically the gas price today, which the industry thinks is too low, and it's come down a lot, is basically less than $30 per barrel equivalent. It peaked last year up at more than double that price, $60, $70 a barrel equivalent. The industry thinks that you probably only need to go to about $40 a barrel equivalent to have sustained increases in production of the sort that I was describing a moment ago. If this was just about the United States, I mean, this would be an interesting story, but not a monumental one. These unconventional gas resources have been barely touched in any other part of the world. It is a concept that you mention it in European industry and policy circles, and people just look at you like you've said that the world is upside down. They've never heard of this concept. In Europe, natural gas is something you import from the Russians or from the North Africans. The price is actually contractually linked to the price of oil, and it's something that you basically want to minimize the use of whenever possible. But this map demonstrates, and I'm sorry it's not at a greater level of detail, but that there are, and this is just shale, by the way, there's also a lot of the other unconventional gas in other parts of the world. Now, that these are truly global resources, and that if other countries put in place the policies, that they will be able to develop these kinds of resources as well. There already are a number of efforts now to explore and develop unconventional gas, both in China fairly extensively and also in several parts of Europe. Interestingly, in Europe, some of the countries that are most threatened by this dependence on Russian gas, countries like Poland and Hungary, have some very promising shale formations. But in terms of decarbonization, of course, the really big question, and it's one that's certainly not fully answered yet. I think that we'll know a lot more in 2 or 3 years, but the extent of the resource base that exists for this in both China and in India. In China, it's almost certainly true that there are extensive resources. The shale piece of it is the most unknown at this point. Coal bed methane is clearly pretty ubiquitous there. But I think that there are a number of geologists that think that there's good reason to think that these resources are really very abundant in China as well. We are going to be doing an event with government leaders, with business and NGO leaders as well in Copenhagen to basically introduce this concept and really get this discussion going on a global basis, so that the countries like China and India can begin thinking about the possibility of replacing, in the case of China, 70–80% of the electricity comes from coal, to replace some of that with natural gas as well as renewables. These are rough estimates of the unconventional resources available in some parts of the world. These are almost certainly underestimates. You can see the figures are much bigger for North America, way out of proportion to the size of the geography. Well over half of the natural gas wells ever drilled anywhere in the world have been drilled in the lower 48 United States. So there's not been the kind of geological work in many other parts of the world. But you can see, even based on these figures, this is a truly abundant resource. Particularly large resources in China, in Russia and other parts of the former Soviet Union, the Middle East, obviously, and of course Latin America. Let me come back now in concluding, though, to the broader energy transition. We need, I believe, to move very, very strongly into renewables in the near future. And I think that this graph, which shows the average annual growth rate for different energy sources in the world over the last 5 years, is probably the best single measure that we have of the fact that we are in the middle of a real transformation. You know, Silicon Valley discovered long ago that if you want to either understand the future or be economically successful in the future, you don't want to look at current market share today, which is basically what our power industry tends to do. They say, well, you know, it's a tautology. We have to be dependent on coal because we are dependent on coal today, and that is, you just can't change that. That's going to continue into the future. And why would you, as a serious energy company, want to invest in things that have, you know, 2, 3, 5, 6% market share today? Now, Silicon Valley wouldn't exist if that way of thinking prevailed here. I mean, when the new entrepreneurs, you know, whether it be Intel or Google started up, their particular area of technology was an insignificant share of the market. I mean, IBM, you know, made what they thought was a very smart decision to not bid on the contract for developing the original ARPANET. They just didn't fit their business model. Mainframes were dominant. They would be dominant for the indefinite future. But if you want to understand the future, you look not at the fact that coal has more than half the market share. You look at the fact that coal is now growing worldwide at a great rate of 5.7% a year, but almost all that growth is in China. If you move that over to the United States and Europe, and indeed most of the rest of the world, you'd find that growth rate under 2%, making it, you know, more in the league of where oil 1.2%, nuclear 0.7% is. So I think that you're going to just see, as a result of the learning curves that are being followed by things like solar and wind and bioenergy, you're going to see dramatic declines in cost. In fact, by the end of this year, we may have seen, and I just saw these figures at a company I was visiting this morning, I think we may have seen something like a halving in the cost of solar photovoltaics in a period of about 18 months. I mean, this stuff is really starting to happen now in a very serious way. But if we're really serious about transforming the power system, getting rid of those coal plants, we have to have a credible way of running the grid and having a power system that delivers power when you need it 24/7. Now, smart grid plays a big role in that. Backup storage technologies, plug-in vehicles. But I think that in terms of being able to do it quickly, to do it at scale, being able to rely significantly on some of these very efficient natural gas-fired technologies is going to make a huge difference, and I think really lays to rest what has been the strongest remaining argument against the idea that we could really transform our power system. This just shows the way in which, and this is similar to what I just showed you, renewable share of total global power generation at the bottom is still less than 5%. This is, by the way, all renewables except large hydro. But as a share of new capacity additions, it's now up to about 23% and growing very quickly. Natural gas, by the way, would be number 2 in most countries, with the exception of China and India. This gives you a sense of this is the power system today, coal at 50%, nuclear at 20%, and you can see that natural gas is at 17%, having actually grown fairly significantly over the last decade. The new renewables are only at about 2%. Here's what our U.S. Department of Energy projected for the year 2030. Coal actually going up to 56%. This is the official view of the U.S. government. Nuclear going up a bit to 19%. Natural gas just going up very slightly. And the new renewables going up only to 5% of the total. Here is where we think we could be in the year 2030. And you can see we've got wind at 20%, very doable, solar photovoltaics distributed solar at 12%, solar central power at 10%, nuclear declining as plants are shut down, biomass growing, geothermal growing a little bit to 5%. And then we don't have any conventional coal or for that matter, gas in this scenario. It's all distributed cogeneration. There probably would be some dedicated peaking units included there, but we think a system like that, and this is really almost a back of the envelope calculation, but we think that a system like that is actually reasonably viable as soon as 2030. Interestingly, most of the technology to do this already exists. Certainly the gas infrastructure is in place. And I think if you combine this, again, with aggressive introduction of smart grid and perhaps a very limited amount of electric storage and some plug-in vehicles, we think that this is probably doable. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you all. Going to try to present a little bit different view. Rather than a worldwide view, I want to take a look at California and tell you sort of what we've been working on at E3 and another sort of perspective on what it will take to hit the really deep cuts in GHG emissions, something on the order of 80% below 1990 levels. I wanted to say a couple words about E3. We're a small consulting company located in San Francisco. We have a number of Stanford alums working for us and also Cal alums. We do work in sort of the range of electricity sector policies, regulatory issues. I've been working myself on energy efficiency, distributed resources, resource planning for utilities. We've been looking at smart grid, energy storage, electric vehicles, and the interaction between all of those and planning on the utility side. We do have an internship program, as Carl mentioned. We have had, over the last 3 years, a Stanford graduate student as an intern, and those have gone really well. I think there are some example internship projects that have been completed on the back of the flyer. And if you're interested, please let me know. I'm going to kind of step through a little bit to talk about the 2050 vision of sort of what we think viable pathways are to hit the California policy goals for CO2 emissions in 2050. And then step back and ask the question, well, what can we use natural gas for as a bridge? There are two main policy goals in California. One that's set by AB 32, which is to get back to 1990 levels by 2020. And this has been really the big policy focus in California. You may have heard of the AB 32 scoping plan, which is really a whole list of measures that can reduce carbon in the state. And most of the policy attention has been focused on that goal. But there's also an executive order to look at basically mandating that California will hit a 2050 target. And that is 80% below 1990 levels. And so a study that we actually are releasing today, that's available on our website, you can download a copy, is our look at different pathways to meet this 2050 goal. So what does 80% below 1990 levels really look like? And on the left side, we've got a business as usual baseline set of emissions for California, which, by the way, is predominantly natural gas. So if you look at the emissions levels we've had since 1990, kind of extrapolating out, and you break down emissions by sector, only meeting the incremental electricity demand through natural gas combined cycle power plants, which is sort of our backbone of the generation in the state, you end up with an increase of about a factor of 2 over 1990 levels. Okay? If you want to hit a compliance scenario for 2050, you've got to take a pretty dramatically different path. And one of our compliant cases for 2050, broken out by sector, will give you emissions that do something like this. Okay? The AB32 scoping plan measures, when you roll them all together and do an assessment, actually do get back to 1990 levels. That's sort of that kink in the curve. And then if you keep applying additional strategies on top of that, you can get to this 80% reduction. So what kind of measures are we talking about that are necessary to get down to that level? So really, there are 5 things, and I would love to have the time to dig into each of them. But I want to point out kind of the 3 big things that we've done to create what we think is a viable pathway to get to this level of emissions. The first thing is energy efficiency. Okay, we need unprecedented levels of energy efficiency, and not for the reason that most folks generally talk about, which is that energy efficiency is a rarely low-cost resource. But also the amount of infrastructure that we need to build to provide all of the low-carbon generation is really not feasible unless we can get dramatic amounts of savings. In other words, even if we're going to do solar thermal in the Mojave Desert, even if we're going to do wind up and down the state, we just can't build enough of those units. Or if we do nuclear, or if we do CCS, without energy efficiency, the construction project is just simply too vast. The second thing and the third thing we need to do really come together. And that is simultaneously electrifying our energy use. So the transportation fleet, the industrial process and boilers, your home heat, pretty much anything that you can electrify, you need, that currently uses fossil fuels, you need to do that. But that doesn't actually reduce carbon to the limit unless you also decarbonize electric generation. Okay? And in our study, we really worked through 3 pathways that could be done. One is through a mix of renewables. One is through carbon capture and sequestration, and the other is nuclear power. Or it could be a combination. So if we put each of those measures sort of on our wedges chart, you can see where the emissions come from. And basically, the decarbonized electricity and electrification of vehicles is this wedge all the way here. We have a little biofuels, we have a little conservation, but we have another big wedge in energy efficiency. Okay? So you need all of those things working together. Now, what's missing from our compliant case is natural gas, unsequestered natural gas generation. Okay? And so why is that? Why can't we fit this existing technology that works well? The prices of natural gas have come down significantly. As Chris mentioned, the reserves for natural gas have increased significantly. Well, natural gas is a fossil fuel, and it has considerable carbon content. So if you look at the carbon content of natural gas relative to other fuels, it's lower, but something not even quite half of what coal is. Now, it's also true that you can combust natural gas more efficiently than coal, and you can capture even more efficiency gains through cogeneration. But even the most efficient cogeneration, if used in the 2050 scenario for California, will exceed our 80% target. So what are we doing rather than natural gas? So the fleet of combined cycle generators in California would have to become replaced with one of our alternatives, renewable nuclear CCS. The CHP units that we have in California would have to be replaced with efficiency and electric boilers. Water heating has to go towards solar water heating and electric backup. Space heating replaced with efficiency, but also electric heat pumps. And even cooking, the last possible end use that our team was hanging on to, has to be electrified. California looks quite a bit different than the rest of the world. We've really already, in many ways, taken the natural gas pathway and have developed most of our electric generation fleet with cogeneration and combined cycles. This is the total emissions per capita on the West Coast for buildings and transportation and, let's see, so this is the electric generation. See if I can, this is a test of my memory here. This is electric gen, this is transportation, and let's see, help me, Amber?
Yellow is on-site building.
Oh, on-site building use, like your natural gas heater or what have you. Notice that transportation is about the same per capita across the country. I don't remember which is which exactly, but the California and West Coast savings is really coming from our already natural gas generator fleet, plus our nuclear, plus our hydro. The total emissions per capita in California is something more like 14, so this just has a subset of the major energy uses. If you compare this to China, you would end up with something like 5 total per capita, and India, something even lower than that, on the order of 2 or 3. So while it is true that China and India have huge populations and they're a major concern for the global CO2 emissions in terms of tons, in terms of an equity issue, we already far exceed the emissions levels relative to those countries. So what about natural gas as a bridging strategy? I hope that I've convinced you that we can't meet our state targets with natural gas as a fuel without carbon capture and sequestration. So why don't we use it as a bridging strategy? And we think, and I'm about to propose my sort of top 3 ideas for use of natural gas as a bridge. But before that, I wanted to kind of get to the cautions. And the first is stranded assets. So new power plants have useful lives of around 40 years. And if we're looking at a 2050 goal, that's about 40 years away. So if we're going to be investing in new natural gas generation over the next, beyond the next 10 years or so, we're going to start to get to a point where we're investing in infrastructure that's not compatible with the long-term goal, and it will still have a useful life after we've needed to retire it. So I think that's one risk. The other risk that I see is a delay in R&D of the transformative low-carbon technologies that we really need to get to solve the climate change problem. So while we could take considerable pressure off in the near term, I think if we say that natural gas is going to solve the problem of climate change, that we're going to do a disservice by delaying development of new technology that we really need to get to do the deep cuts. And I think that those critical breakthroughs include energy efficiency, energy storage technologies, biofuels, carbon capture and sequestration, and solar thermal. So we have to be mindful of that. And finally, I think that kind of comes together with the risk of missing the transition away from natural gas that we will need in 10 or 20 years. Okay, so given those cautions aside, what are my sort of top 3 bridging opportunities? Well, the first one is hybrid renewables, gas power generation, and I'm really thinking about solar thermal technology with natural gas as well to assist. Because of the way that the federal investment tax credit is structured, really penalizes a hybrid renewable power plant. And this is something that you can use a lot of the existing power block that you would need in a solar thermal plant, but that you're basically just prohibited from using natural gas and getting the capacity and the cycling and the load following out of. And so to me, that's a very easy and useful use of natural gas, basically to help us get more of the renewable energy out of our renewable plants with a hybrid kind of strategy. The second is natural gas vehicles, especially for the East Coast and other parts of the country where natural gas vehicles, where electric vehicles would have relatively high emissions if we're powering them with coal. And the reason I like natural gas vehicles is because natural gas costs are low, so the fuel is actually cheaper. We have the infrastructure to deliver it. And the life cycle of a gas vehicle is, we've got multiple life cycles before the 2050, so we're not investing in new infrastructure that will still be in place largely as we go out over time. And the third top bridging opportunity, I think, while it's not specifically a natural gas measure, is really a federal ban on new coal. I think that given the relative prices of coal and gas currently, given that the risks of building new coal and locking in those emissions over that 40-year life, that this might be some not necessarily easy ground to take, but some possible ground to take. So a federal ban, much like we have in California, by the way, of new coal would sort of be my third bridging opportunity. So thank you all for your attention, and I'm sure both Chris and I would be happy to take questions.
Actually, I wanted to ask Chris what his top three bridging opportunities he thought would be, addressing the same as the last slide that Snu showed.
Yeah, the one I would add would be decentralized, a new era of decentralized technologies to deploy large-scale cogeneration, and that's going to require some changes in the electricity law. It basically is not incentivized in most states at this point. So I think there's been massive underinvestment in that area. But I think we're actually largely in agreement. I mean, I think our big differences are really in terms of the time frame, but really more importantly, California is just not typical. And frankly, California isn't the big challenge when it comes to dealing with the CO2 problem. I mean, I'm very pleased that California is leading the way it is, but it's really, you really got to look at the Midwestern, southern parts of this country, and then you've basically got a similar situation in much of China, and those areas are the ones where the decarbonization really is a priority. I agree with the idea of having a ban on new coal-fired power plants, but that policy wouldn't have a big impact because there are very few coal-fired power plants being built. The battle is now shifting. I mean, the Sierra Club has been successful, helped by the market in stopping most of the coal-fired power plants that were on the drawing board. The challenge now is to shut down the existing plants, and particularly to get some incentives in place so that these old inefficient plants get turned off as soon as possible.
Well, I would disagree about the research and development. With the exception of geothermal, we're in pretty good shape. Solar, for example, is already on track to become cheaper than nuclear and coal in the near future. So that will be an interesting change in the landscape. My question is, I feel political factors are dominant. While we no longer have the organized foot dragging of the Bush administration, the fact is that the coal and oil industries have huge numbers of lobbyists deployed with the intention of either preventing a carbon tax or preventing any meaningful regulation of their emissions. What do you see as the possibility of moving forward in terms of getting a political consensus that these power sources should be phased out?
So let me take a shot at that, and then Chris, you could take a shot at it. From what I've been following with the federal climate change sort of grand bargain, is that they've tried to do something that's just exceptionally difficult. They've the basic focus on a cap and trade bill with the revenues from the auctions or proceeds going to different stakeholders and industries and lobbyists, I think is, while it may get done someday, is just exceptionally difficult to get through. And at the same time, I feel a little bit of frustration that there are basically low-hanging fruit that we could take that are not as difficult to pass that could be done. And I think no new coal power plants is an example of something like that. It's not a market. I'm not a big, huge fan of cap and trade. I think it just goes right to the source. And while, for example, we're not building a lot of new coal plants because of the relative economics with gas, I think it's a huge political message for the world if the US would enact something like that. Plus, it would also prevent backsliding. I think there's other easy ground to take in natural gas vehicles. I know that in California, where I've studied it the closest, there's big war with oil companies versus natural gas companies around pricing of natural gas for the transportation sector. And basic monopoly arguments around whether we're leveraging ratepayer dollars in our natural gas utilities to unfairly compete with oil companies. So there's probably some policies that have to be passed in order to make something like natural gas. I think energy efficiency and building standards is another thing that the federal government could do and lead on that they haven't been, that I think is essentially low-hanging fruit. So I think while there's a potential at some point to do the grand bargain around cap and trade or maybe a carbon tax, there's a lot of ground that could be taken on specific things that target sources of emissions.
I think that the only successful way forward is to not take on those interests head on, but to be very clever in terms of finding things that can be done, either policies that Congress adopts or things that the executive branch can simply do on its own now that the good guys are in control, that will have the effect that you want. But I think taking on those interests head on by saying, we're going to ban coal-fired power plants or have a major transition in a short term. I mean, the votes just aren't there to do that kind of stuff. And in fact, you mobilize the opposition. But I think the system is a lot more vulnerable to change than people often recognized. I mean, the older coal-fired power plants aren't actually even very economical to operate anymore. They're not efficient. Coal prices have gone up. The Chinese are starting to buy coal as well, and their liabilities. And it wouldn't take much of a carrot to persuade quite a number of electric utilities that they would be better off shutting it down. You got to break that alliance between the utilities, which is really where the power is, and the coal mining industry, which is frankly, from an economic point of view, a trivial industry. I mean, it appears to have great political power, but I think it's largely sort of a mirage that could fade fairly quickly because economically it's just not that substantial. One of the most interesting opportunities that's out there is through existing EPA regulatory authority. Not only the CO2 authority, which the Supreme Court has now said that it has, assuming Congress doesn't give it away in the course of the legislation, but interestingly, there's sort of a bank shot here, which is these older plants are not compliant on mercury and variety of conventional pollutants. The EPA has the authority to start making life very difficult for these folks. And so I think that there are some things that can be done that will really sort of accelerate that process and do it in a way that you're not having to win the mega political battle, because again the votes are just not there to do this. We're going to have to do this 2 or 3 yards at a time. I mean, this is not going to be the sort of Hail Mary pass. But I think that if we effectively pursue that strategy, everything from EPA being smart, Sierra Club keeping up its lawsuits, the renewables and these new decentralized gas technologies continuing to advance, and the utilities beginning to recognize what's really in their own self-interest, that things could really change.
Talk about the environmental concerns in extracting natural gas?
Excellent question, and I'm actually sorry I didn't include that in my presentation. There are an important set of environmental issues that are actually getting a lot of attention as this gas drilling boom begins to unfold. Probably the most serious problem is potential water pollution, and the issue there is basically that you send water down into these systems and then bring it back up, and it has chemicals in it, so it has to be effectively disposed of. Fortuitously, where this gas is actually located is well below any water table. So you, of course, need to go through the water tables to get there, so you need to make sure you've got a very solid system in place. But it's really the disposal issue with the water that I think is the biggest environmental issue. And one of the problems is that this industry has unfolded so quickly that a lot of the states don't have the regulatory system in place. And frankly, a lot of these companies, these natural gas development companies, they're used to operating in Texas and Oklahoma, which have a little different sensibility than, when you start. I mean, they're literally starting to drill for shale gas on the outskirts of New York City now. And you can imagine the kind of reaction. And in fact, one of the big companies has just pulled out. They said, we're on to finding shale someplace else, that we don't really want to mess with the local authorities around New York State. But there clearly is a whole regulatory system that needs to be developed. There are potential problems that can be created if this is done in the wrong way. But for my environmentalist friends, I've got an analogy I like to use, which I think is actually not too bad, which is that it's a little bit like the kind of problems the early wind industry got into, which was with a lot of bird kills. Putting wind farms in the wrong areas without any systems in place to warn the birds away, and you got serious kills, in some cases involving endangered species. Some people said, well, that's it, no more wind power, that's the end of that energy resource, neglecting the fact that, who knows how many birds are killed by the conventional energy system we have in place. But of course, the industry worked through that. I was actually on an advisory board to the Department of Energy, working through all the environmental issues, coming up with mitigation strategies. Something like that needs to be done with natural gas now.
As someone who agrees with your basic argument, Chris, I think there are two other points you didn't make, and one is that by switching to natural gas, you can achieve even the short-term carbon savings, mandated in Waxman-Markey and Carey-Boxer of something on the order of 20% in 20 years, which is now the expectation you're going to get it from CCS, which is simply going to be impossible in the central and eastern United States. The geology just won't permit it, even if you solve the carbon capture problem, which is not at all certain. And the second advantage is you've already got an infrastructure of existing electrical generation capacity from gas-powered plants that's basically going unutilized. Yeah. So there's an awful lot. There's an awful lot that
absolutely
makes what you're saying very, very practical for the next 20 or 30 years. But my question is something like the first one. It's been remarkable that the House didn't get it in Waxman-Markey, the Senate didn't get it in the first version of Carey-Boxer, and the DOE, as represented by the Undersecretary of Energy, who was here about a week ago, presented a coal plus nuclear energy plan with a few smart grid and a few other little, bells and whistles like improved hydro.
Who was it who made that presentation?
It was Christina Johnson. And it was 50 new power plants in the next 20 years was the base plan. Of course, and investments in renewables and some unrealistic expectations of their market share. And so I guess to come back to the first question is, you presented the case very clearly, and I think the entire oil and gas industry would make exactly the same case. The environmental industry is making the same case, but Congress doesn't get it, and the Department of Energy doesn't get it, and it's really not clear why.
I think the answer is pretty simple, which is virtually nobody is actually effectively making this argument on the Hill. The natural gas industry is certainly not effectively making this argument. Now, there are some progressive forces in that industry that are just starting to come around. Tim Wirth and I are both working with a pretty small segment right now of the industry. We're hoping to change it, but basically you've got an enormous basically pro-coal lobby, which is not only the coal companies but the power companies, and then the coal-dependent economies that have convinced themselves that for their regions of the country it would be an economic disaster to have to do away with coal, and they do not understand that there are other options. I think time frames are really important here in terms of sort of understanding what we can do by when. I think you're exactly right. There's analysis that shows that by 2020, something close to half of the reductions in that would be required under either the House or Senate bill could actually be met most economically from fuel switching. The rest of it coming from a combination of efficiency and renewables. There is not anybody that I know of that thinks that either nuclear or CCS will play any role at all in 2020. Okay, even the optimists. I mean, if you actually parse what they're really saying, these are technologies that begin to deploy on scale under an optimistic scenario, and I would argue very optimistic scenario, between 2020 and 2030. The least optimistic scenario is that they never deploy at all. I mean, I think that's true with both of those. I mean, the question of whether they will ever be economically viable against the alternatives, and I appreciate you were very open-minded in your study and said, it could be CCS, it could be nuclear, it could be renewables, and I think it could be a lot of this new gas technology. But the gas and renewables option are very different in terms of we actually know pretty well where these are going to be in 2020. I mean, we certainly know that they're going to be available on a much larger scale at a significantly lower cost. There obviously are error bands. At what pace will solar continue to fall in price? There are all these kinds of questions, but there is a very different sort of qualitative character to these options, and this ability to both fuel switch at existing plants. I mean, even the Chinese have, in Beijing have converted coal plants over to natural gas. You do that in less than a year. There's a very tight planning horizon on all of that. You can build both distributed generation and renewables generation usually in 2 or 3 years. It's just a very, very different kind of time scale. And so, I think it's great that you're looking at 2050 scenarios, but I think the world is changing so rapidly now that frankly none of us have any idea what the world in 2050 or what the appropriate mix of technologies really will be. I think we can begin to get a handle on 2030. The question is sort of what is the glide path, and I think that the key right now is really to focus on that 2020 to 2030 time frame. And I would frankly, because of the nature of the technologies we're deploying, I wouldn't be so worried about possibly this will not be sort of state of the art when we get to 2050. I mean, look what Stanford is doing now. Stanford 20 years ago built a state of the art cogeneration unit. Many campuses still don't have cogeneration, and yet now that's going to be replaced by a regeneration system because Stanford engineers have figured out that 20 years later, there's something that's so much better that even though there is more useful life left in that system, it really should be replaced. And the nature of the kind of technologies that I'm advocating for, you don't need to assume that they're going to last for a half century for them to be economical. I mean, if you're putting on a cogeneration unit that is built on an automobile engine, you're probably going to be replacing it in 20 or 25 years anyway. So I think we have to not be so paralyzed and obsessed that there's going to be this magic CCS or this magical new nuclear technology that will be suddenly delivered on a platter in 2050 that it paralyzes and we don't do anything in the meantime.
Right. Well, I don't think it would be delivered magically on a platter. That's why I think we need the development and focus and the kind of studies around what 2050 might look like that actually hits a CO2 level that the scientists are telling us we have to reach to prevent catastrophic climate change. So I don't think effort focused on 2050 is irrelevant at all. I think it tells us about the plans simply just don't fit in our CO2 budget. So I know that they're existing technology, I know that they're relatively low cost, and that's fine as a bridge, but isn't it, I think we can learn about the types of technologies that we will ultimately need in order to hit the long-term goals. And I tried to list a few of those. I think energy efficiency, I think that energy storage and batteries. If we're really going to electrify vehicles, we need better batteries. We need bulk system storage, especially if we're going to take a renewable pathway to be able to balance the grid and provide reliability that we need. Obviously, natural gas can be a part of that as well. But to sort of paint the picture, the policy picture in the long term, some of the analysis we've seen on the federal level by the EPA just ignores things like the transportation sector, pretty much. And other sectors that are, that are a tough nut to crack politically.
Yeah.
And so why not take a look at these pathways and add them up and see whether or not the policies we're enacting today get us to where we need to go ultimately.
Would you be opposed, say, if PG&E were to announce a major program to invest in distributed natural gas cogeneration in buildings across Northern California?
No, I wouldn't. I've been talking to PG&E about that. I don't think they would propose that unless it could be a utility-owned cogen system. And I've worked through some of those economics.
Yeah.
So we've been working with PG&E around distributed generation for 15 years. So I don't think that's likely to happen. I think that, and I think that the time frame and the scales for something like a furnace that produced electricity, I think that the challenges for that technology would get to more around the thermal matching. So do you need the heat at the same time you need the electricity in a residential application because you've kind of got a summer-winter problem. And so there's some issues, I think, around that particular application. But I think that PG&E is more likely to push something like electric vehicles and smart charging with their low carbon electricity generation base and controlled charging. They can sell a lot more kilowatt hours in the middle of the night and save significant amount of carbon in California. So from a utility regulatory strategy, I think that probably makes a lot more sense to their senior management.
Can I just ask one quick question? 'Cause I think this is important. I mean, your system, relies very heavily on electrification and having, basically going to a carbon-free power generation. Otherwise, the thing doesn't work. Let's assume that we don't get to a point where Californians are ready to build massive amounts of CCS and nuclear. What does a low carbon, or 90% carbon-free renewable power system look like in your mind?
Yeah, so the way our modeling works, we actually have an operational model of our power system. So we look at load shapes and what the dispatch is of those dispatchable resources versus the shapes of wind and hydro that are somewhat fixed, but flexible within their means. To push up to a corner point for our California system, we were able to get to something like 70% renewables energy. And at that point, we basically couldn't get grid stability, grid operability, or what have you. In order to do that, we also had to have massive amounts of bulk system electricity storage. Okay, so something like 12,000 megawatts of 4-hour storage or something like that. So you need to be able to really balance out the wind and particularly Solar thermal, the reason I'm such a big fan of solar thermal hybrid systems is because it's almost all renewable energy, but you can still get the capacity of what the system needs. Yet you can't build one because the federal tax code is kind of a purist when it comes to renewable technology and the investment tax credit. So beyond that, you can't, and with that renewable case, you still, to be perfectly honest, can't quite meet the 80% reduction because you have some gas rebalancing, because you have these other emissions of things that you can't electrify. But at the same time, you're getting pretty darn close. So it's got, I guess the other big thing with electrification of vehicles is controlled charging. And with that, what you can do is really dramatically improve the load factor on the system. Basically shifting the charging to the middle of the night so that you can improve, so that you can get a steadier load, which does tremendous things for your economics of your electric grid and your utility, which kind of makes the costs somewhat more, palatable overall. Without something like that, with decreasing load factors as industry goes away, as you pointed out, you end up with much higher costs. So I don't know. That's one vision of it, and we've built some operational models at a high level to sort of try to take a look at what that system might look like.
Okay. Well, I want to encourage everyone to download both the report that you just put out today, and also there's a report called Low Carbon Energy that's available at World Watch. They give two different views on these different perspectives. But they still drive towards a low-carbon economy that I think most of us here believe we have to drive towards. So thank you all very much for coming.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.